the fourth iteration of the Baer Faxt Live from Basel. As I always say, it's Basel. Just remember,
Basel.
you've been to Basel a lot. So
Yes.
thank you, Artlogic, for sponsoring this edition of the Baer Faxt Live. From inventory and accounts management to websites and payments, to discover why the art world runs on Artlogic today. And now we're joined by an old friend of mine, Sarah Thornton, and she's a best-selling authoress. You say this author or authoress? Writer?
I actually usually say writer because some authors didn't actually write their own book. They just published a book, So you can have like a management consultant who's an author, but they're not really a writer. I am like a craftsperson, who loves a good word and sentence and likes a nice structure for my book. So I call myself a writer.
Well, the most interesting part, and we'll get to it in the art world, is really not just a writer, that you came to writing about the art world from the vantage point of being an ethnographer. And I think that's the most important distinction about your work, is that you're not so much a journalist, that you came to the art world as that. So could you talk about that briefly and maybe follow up with this, like, as an ethnographer, what did you think of Art Basel so far? So explain that a little bit.
Well, yes, there are two main people who write about the art world or art, and those are art critics, who may come from art history or English lit sometimes, and journalists. So the art critics focus on the work itself. The journalists are often focused on the news and the market, and as an ethnographer, I'm focused on the people and society and the sociality of the art world. And so, I like, one of my pet themes is the way work accrues value through social consensus. That's a very sociological or ethnographic question to ask. And So what were my big thoughts today? Well,
let me phrase it this way. So when you wrote 7 Days in the Art World,
yes,
you were really coming in as an outsider studying this ecosystem. And now you're on your fourth book, which is titled
Tits Up.
Tits Up.
There we go. It's about breasts.
So now as an insider,
yes,
taking the same look at all those people swirling around, from that vantage point, what did you observe today from the fair?
Well, it's interesting. I've been to Basel, as they call it. I went to every edition of Basel from 2003 to the pandemic. And then I was only here in September 2021, and now I'm back. So it's interesting that the pandemic has disrupted these events. I feel like it felt a little quieter than before the pandemic to me. September 2021 was quiet, like very quiet. That's not what it's like here today. I spent all of my time upstairs, so I can't comment on downstairs. Upstairs being the younger galleries as a rule, living artists, emergent artists, less dead artists. But I did not feel frenzy. I did not feel the kind of frothy fight over the sought after work in the same way I did in 2006, 2007, let's say. So I think there's sales, people are serious, but there's less kind of urgency.
So can you put it in more formal academic terms to your field, like watching the people walking around? Are they like how they're behaving, how they're interacting with each other? Is there any sort of like...
Well, I think there's more self-awareness about the social competition involved in the art world. So, whereas in 2006, 2007, someone might be in the throes of it and they're like, if I don't get that work by so-and-so and, Joe Schmo over here does, then I'm going to be offended and wounded and my stature will be decreased. I mean, I think that the pandemic forced us all to take a step back from that. And I think the global political situation, especially for the Anglo-Americans, both of whom have elections upcoming, for the Brits July 4th, for the Americans in November, there's a distancing from the kind of social instinct that a lot of people operate with.
So I've been talking a lot about what's obvious, which is polarization. Mm-hmm. So are you saying that just people walking around the building have sort of self-polarized and they're not quite interacting the same way? Or is it post-COVID, don't get too close? Or are you seeing how they're dealing with the dealers? Or
so I don't see polarization here. I haven't noticed it, actually. I mean, I think that
because it's such a homogeneous crowd?
Pretty well. On a certain level, I would say people who are interested in contemporary art versus, let's say, medieval armor, or national trophies, historic trophies, are kind of generally pro-globalization. They're capitalists. They're usually siding with the winner. Even if they, lean a little left on certain social issues, they're not like radical lefties. So I would say, I have not noticed any of that kind of factional tension at all. It's not to say it doesn't exist, but I have not experienced it today.
And on 20 years of looking and being at the fair, what do you know now that you didn't know then that surprises you?
Have I been surprised by anything at this edition of Basel?
Or recently, that when you started looking and observing art fairs that you thought you knew, mm-hmm. and you realized, wow, that's not it, or has changed than it used to be, and you knew, and now you're not so sure of?
I think that on a personal level, my perspective has shifted twofold. So I went from being an outsider to an insider, but I've also gone from being an outsider to someone who's actually married to a dealer.
That's a big change to be married to somebody who exhibits at fairs like these.
Exactly. So my partner, Jessica Silverman, based in San Francisco, has long shown at Art Basel Miami Beach. She's shown at Art Basel Hong Kong, and for many years showed at FIAC, and she will be in the November edition of Art Basel Paris, but has a spotty experience getting into Basel. And
well, then she should watch
a frustration, and
she should watch
so it's hard for
our
me
previous
to speak.
episode where we talked about that with the fair of that process. So she'll be curious to see. We address that directly.
Good. It's interesting. So, I think the dealers who are in and out of Art Basel, and mostly in Art Basel, start to look at the club and the committees in a very forensic way, which, as an ethnographer, I focused more broadly on the collectors, the dealers, the fair directors, yes, but less so on the forensic of committee members. So I've had a critical look at quite a few booths today, let's say.
What were your...
without naming any names.
What were your B2B thoughts?
My B2B thoughts were...
What is B2B for you?
Business to business thoughts?
Boobs to booths.
Oh, boobs to booths. Well, thank you so much for asking, Josh. I can say with great authority that there are 2 booths in the upstairs part of the fair that have the best breasts by far. And they would be Sadie Coles, who's got a number of different boobs in acrylic, oil, cement, and various media. And then also PPOW have many diverse and interesting breasts on their booth too. So it's interesting when certain dealers are just drawn to artists who deal with the body. you go into some booths and there's no body in the work. They're like, as some might say, dry Kunst. They're abstract conceptual works. That's a particular predilection. And then there are other dealers who are drawn to work that addresses the body. I, as someone who lives in San Francisco, not just because I wrote a book about boobs, but because I live in San Francisco and I'm, up on the hill over Silicon Valley, I think a lot about what artificial intelligence doesn't have. And artificial intelligence does not have a body. And so I'm very interested in human intelligence as something quite different from artificial intelligence. And, artificial intelligence may very well exceed, the way we think from above the neck, but we have a lot of neurons in the rest of our body. And so I'm really interested in art, broadly speaking, that addresses the body.
Within that, sort of as a
I think that's the way forward, actually.
sense of the body, the sense of identity seems to have come back in a very strong way in art making the last few years, but maybe in a very different way. For me, that's been an old issue in art that I've looked at for at least 30 years. And I'm wondering if you see that it's the same subject or it's a different take on the same subject, identity versus, the classic 60s or 70s identity politics and all the identity art that was probably on the second floor.
Well, it's interesting because about 15 years ago, it was so unfashionable to mention the word identity. And at that time, I think it was very much a way for white men or the culture of white men to maintain its dominance. And I think the past 15 years, and especially the past 10 years, we've seen a great shift towards the inclusion of women, the inclusion of people of color. And so for me, identity as like a number one issue is in a work is perhaps not so interesting, but there's no escaping it, I don't think. I think kind of didactic work around identity is I like exploratory work, I guess you could say.
Oh, with the
like
AI,
work that puzzles me.
AI doesn't do so good on exploring.
No, it's great
It
at
searches.
cliches. AI is like a master of cliche, at least when it comes to ChatGPT. It's just like.
Have you checked your own writing to see if it thinks it's plagiarism? Have you ever stuck your own writing in? I know the students.
No, I haven't.
It's like at a paper you stuck in your writing, and you can check to see if it thinks it's.
Well, I
written by
have
AI.
asked.
You should check.
I've asked ChatGPT various questions about breasts, and it's amazing. It knows nothing. It knows nothing for a lot of reasons, not just because it doesn't have a body, but because the written record around women's experience of their bodies is not actually being really pulled into the database.
But here's a question. The market has always rewarded images of breasts, right? It's certainly
certain kinds.
There
in
certain
ideal
ways,
breasts, and
yes.
then we see a lot more. Let's say we see a lot more breasts in the fair today than we did 10 or 15 years ago that divert from European beauty norms or Anglo-American beauty norms. And so, we're much more likely to see like things that are odd, let's say, that aren't in fashion magazines, that aren't porn perfect,
Sure enough, but what about the boys? It's like.
We've seen some nipples. There's nipples.
Is the next book going to be about penises in the art world? Those don't sell so well.
Well, it's interesting. I am often asked, having written about the top half, will I now write about the bottom half? And the answer is absolutely not, unless I decide to write about shoes.
But you do have great shoes. We will show them later. It's like, if you know anything about Sarah, she brings her shoe game to the table. That's her A game besides her writing and all that. So it's like, what do you see the future then for all of us? You're 4 books in. What's the next topic? Where are you going? Are you going to leave the art world alone, or are you going to like?
Well,
What's going on?
Thanks for asking. I mean, I think because I'm married to an art dealer, I actually have a lot of conflicts of interest when I.
Conflicts of interest? What? The Baer Faxt? You couldn't have conflicts of interest. I'm going to say for me, just to interrupt you for a second.
Yeah, no problem.
I think that's a strength for me.
Well, a lot of people in the art
It would
world.
be perceived as a weakness.
Well, you could say no conflict, no interest. When it comes to the art world and the way the art market works. Yeah. For me personally, as an ethnographer, I don't like navigating too many conflicts, and I do. But right now, I'm far too partisan, being married to a dealer. So what I'd really like to write about is design. I'm actually interested hugely in fashion, furniture. Graphic logos. I'm interested in design of all kinds, and having written about art for many years, it's great to. And actually, being an ethnographer, I love being on the steep part of the learning curve. I love not knowing the answer to things, and so I don't know what I'm going to do truly, but I'd love to write about design-related things.
Here's the book I'd like to read about the art world from your vantage point. It would be a book about Jessica. And that would really, it's never going to happen unless we're in divorce court or something like that.
Well,
but it would be a fascinating study from the way you've looked at everything to then go there into, that would take a lot of guts on her part.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Jessica shows up in a few paragraphs in Tits Up. But
I throw the gauntlet down. Speaking of gauntlets, what's going on here with this?
This is an Andrea Bauer's work.
You were not in a beauty pageant?
No, I'm not wearing it across my chest like a suffragette.
Miss San Francisco?
But this is an Andrea Bauer's work. She's based in LA, an eco-feminist, and this relates to the environment. So this says clean water, healthy land. And this one says, protecting nature is not a luxury. And it's an artwork that you can wear home.
Can we have it be a luxury? I don't want it to be so serious.
Protecting nature may not be a luxury, but having great access to nature has become a luxury. For a lot of people, if you live live in one of these massive Asian urban centers, and
that would
it
be
can
true.
be difficult to access nature.
Is there a final thought about being here 21 years into Basel? What year did we first meet?
I think we met in 2004.
2004.
I know we met in 2004 because that is chapter 1 of 7 Days in the Art World. Is
my biggest claim to fame. I'm most famous for everything for being in chapter 1 of 7 Days in the Art World.
Well, I wish that were true.
For me,
I'm lucky that book was translated into a lot of languages, so there may be one of those obscure languages. I think it's in Latvian. Maybe that is your Latvian claim to fame.
I'll suffer that.
Let's see. You know what? I love Basel. I love coming here every summer. I don't want to miss an edition anymore. I had raclette cheese for lunch with potatoes, and it was fabulous. And I love Switzerland. I love the reunion of people I see from Canada, where I lived for 20 years, the UK, where I lived for another 25 years, and now the US. And I when I was writing for The Economist, I'd go to the Middle East and Asia, and I see those old art world friends here. And I really love it. And it is a great fair, and I hope everyone does well. And I assume the lack of urgency will just mean that it takes 3 days to sell out the booth rather than 1.
Awesome. Sarah, thank you. And thank you, Artlogic, for sponsoring this edition of the Baer Faxt Live. They're trusted by over 5,000 galleries, artists, collectors. I believe we know somebody who uses them in San Francisco, worldwide. And they provide the tools you need to run your entire art business. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton.
Thank you, Josh.